Thank you so much, Dr. Sweat, Mrs. Lantos, Ms. Rennerstadt. We actually do have time for questions, and these three wonderful ladies have agreed to answer questions. So we're going to pass around a microphone just so that your voice can be recorded. So in the back.
It's actually a plea to the Lantos Foundation, and this is the plea. The anti-Semitism and human rights problems, there's a continuum. And you've talked to us, all three of you, about some of the more extreme ends of the continuum. And I just want to raise something that I think, if journalism is correct, that the Lantos Foundation is uniquely positioned to address. And that is, you alluded to your identity, but if journalism is correct, you, like many others in modern society, have a slightly more complicated identity in terms of religious identity. So where I'm going to go is the persistence of Mormons baptizing victims of the Holocaust who have no biological descendants who became Mormon. Different situation, like your family. If the biological descendants are Mormon, clearly that's a different situation. But for the Anne Franks, for the Dr. Janusz Korczaks, and for the people who wind up on the lists that are now readily available, it is both a human rights violation and an affront. And the reality is, regardless of all the agreements that have been signed and what's been done or whatever, it still goes on. And it's going on, and I just wanted to give you this plea because it seems to me, given your identities and who you are, the next time this bubbles up to the level of the negotiations yet again, I really hope the Lantos Foundation can get involved.
Well, thank you very much for bringing that up. And I think you're right. You know, when this controversy first arose some years ago, if I'm not mistaken, my father was quite active in reaching out to the leadership of the LDS Church to explain that no matter how well-intentioned their thoughts might be, for those of you who may not be familiar with the controversy, maybe I'll just describe it in a real quick nutshell so that everybody isn't scratching their head. But within the Latter-day Saint faith, they believe in a doctrine of being able to perform baptisms for people who have passed on so that, in their view, all possible blessings can be open to them if they choose to accept that. And so while I think people within the Latter-day Saint faith felt this was an act of sort of brotherhood and sisterhood, trying to open a door to blessings, it's quite understandable. I think you can all understand that this practice was quite offensive to the Jewish community more or less everywhere, because, you know, for Jews who through millennia have suffered and often given their lives to stay true to the faith of their fathers, the notion that after they had passed away, someone could come along and baptize them into another faith really felt like a terrible affront. And it's my understanding that the practice has been stopped, and I'm seeing from your shaking head that that may not be the case. So maybe we can talk afterwards, because thank you. Yeah. Okay.
Hi, first, thank you all so much for speaking. As a student of religious studies and human rights, there were just points in each one of your speeches where it really kind of hit home, and thank you so much for your continued fight and inspiration. And I had a question specifically for Dr. Lantos. As you spoke as empathy as one of these main key qualities, and as seeing a friend and a brother in the stranger's face, I'm wondering how you can stand in solidarity with people of all religions, including Muslims, when it's easy to make large generalizations from extremist viewpoints that I think there's a pathological hatred of Jews within that I think you spoke of early. So thank you again.
Yeah, well, you know, first of all, I think, and I'm glad for the opportunity to reemphasize it, when I was speaking about the minority Muslim communities in Europe, I think I was very careful to say that it wasn't representative of all the members of that minority. That's what's so disturbing about the Pew Research results was, you know, these, as I say, almost comical levels. And it's not like this was a study done by, you know, I shouldn't say this because I don't want to imply that this wouldn't be a legitimate study, but let's say you took a well-known Jewish organization that if they had brought forward those results, we might say, well, gosh, you know, are these really credible results? But, you know, the Pew Research Foundation, you know, they're sort of the gold standard just as a, not a think tank, but a fact tank is what they call themselves. And that's why I say these are staggering numbers. These are absolutely staggering numbers. And, you know, speaking perhaps a little more with my political analysis hat on and not sort of strictly my human rights hat, I think many people like myself who are concerned about the degree to which anti-Semitism is deeply embedded in the cultures of many of these Muslim majority countries, as we see these countries very legitimately beginning the long struggle towards legitimate democracy and authentic pluralistic societies and authentic democracies in their country. And obviously, you know, Egypt is in the headlines now because they had this incredible people revolution 2 years ago. Now they've had what to all the world looks like a coup d'etat, and yet you have large numbers of the Egyptian people saying, no, this is the voice of the people. We were being dragged, you know, back into now an Islamist autocracy, very complicated situation. But many of us worry that as they struggle, and it's a long struggle, you know, it's easy to be smug, but you look at Europe, you look at all societies, it took a while to establish functioning liberal democracies, not liberal in the political spectrum of the sense of the word, but liberal in the traditional Lockean sense of the word. And it's going to take them a while, but we worry that not the silver linings playbook, but the dark linings playbook, which is demonizing you know, Jews, finding the target, scapegoating, becomes the way in which societies that are struggling, that are not able to deliver what their people so desperately want and need and deserve, turn to as a means of sort of diverting the anger and the frustration away from them. You know, I think that, I absolutely think that people of religious conviction not only can but must stand shoulder to shoulder. You know, so many of the most heroic figures in history who led the fight for human rights, and we can think about Martin Luther King, we can think about William Wilberforce in history, who was, you know, the great Christian leader who, you know, led to the abolition of the slave trade in Britain. You know, Pastor Niemöller, I mean, you know, if you want to look at history, so much of the advancement of dignity and decency for human beings has been led by people of faith, by people of all faith. And there are incredible stories, positive stories that are also unfolding today. But, you know, if you go up to that 30,000-foot altitude and kind of try to Google map things, we know that this deep, deep hatred is very embedded. And I bring it up because I think it, at the end of the day, will to continue to hold back those countries and those societies. I've used an analogy in the past, and maybe I'll take one more moment because your question is such a thoughtful one to use it here. I am not at all a mathematician. In fact, I'm really, really bad at math. And I don't know if there are any math teachers here, but I envy you and I admire you, and I'm so glad I don't have to take your class because I would do really badly. But I've always been in awe of those depictions of the amazing, incredible equations that cover 3 blackboards, you know, and like, you know, they're just writing away, and it's just incredible and awesome, and at the end, they get to some earth-shattering formula or conclusion or figure out something that we all need to know, even though we don't know we need to know it. But I'm smart enough to know that if you make a mistake here in the equation, it actually doesn't matter how long and how hard you work on the rest of the equation until you go back and fix the mistake you made early on in the equation. You will never, ever, ever get to the right answer. It's impossible. You can't. And to me, this irrational anti-Semitism, this irrational hatred really of their Jewish cousins, which is very saturated in many of these societies is sort of like that mistake early on in the equation. They do want to build, and they have a right to build, and they need to build open, pluralistic, democratic societies where women's rights and everybody's rights are protected. But I feel that they need to confront this because it's sort of a flaw early on in the equation. We had a flaw early on in our equation as a country and as a society. It was slavery. And we ultimately fought a civil war over it. I visited Gettysburg for the first time this year, found it to be one of the most profoundly moving visits of my life. And any of you who have not had the opportunity, I really encourage you to go. We could not become who we needed and were meant to be as a country and as a society until we went back where we had made a very grave mistake in the equation. And we had to go back and fix it. So in that sense, I don't believe in happy talk that papers over things that are not going to be fixed that way. This is not a small thing. This is deeply embedded. And I think that talking about it brings it to the fore. My mom mentioned that the first political campaign my dad got engaged in was Adlai Stevenson's. Well, Adlai Stevenson said, solutions begin by telling the truth. I really believe that. Solutions begin by telling the truth. And some truths are less palatable to hear than others, but that is, I think, where the solutions begin.
Hi, I'm Brandon Wood. I'm a recent graduate from Boston University. Thank you very much for your comments today. I just wanted to kind of challenge the new anti-Semitism concept that you have been discussing. And I want to draw a distinction between possibly anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism, where the kind of anti-Semitism you see in France, where it's very targeted, and it's certainly focusing on Jewish people and Jewish culture, versus the more political anger and even very harsh political critique of Israel. And looking into the Pew research that you did bring up, if that research was more, I kind of want to look at the research myself when I get some time to see if the questions were, are you against Jewish people or are you against the Israeli state? Because that's a very different question, and it definitely changes up the kind of analysis of what's going on in that region. Because, I mean, there are reasons, there could be legitimate reasons to be mad at an Israeli state on political grounds. Even very harshly so. But that's a very different question from it being anti-Semitism. So and you are very careful in trying to maneuver that, but I just wanted to
You know, I agree with you, which is why I think those markers are so helpful. But something that you brought up, and maybe you can remind us of what it was exactly you said, but as I was listening to Christina's comments, I thought this very much supports this kind of three-part test, if you will, for when legitimate criticism, and I hope I did make that point clearly, that in the political, tug of war, obviously no country should consider itself to be immune from criticism, and Israel shouldn't consider that it can just say, don't criticize us because that's actually secret anti-Semitism, when there are legitimate policy things that are in play and can be disagreed with. But I think you said that, was it after the Lebanon war, that there was a huge surge in anti-Semitism in Sweden. And that sort of makes my case in some senses. Because Israel is the only Jewish state in the world, we have many, many countries that, although they may not be officially, some of them do call themselves Christian countries. In Denmark, for example, there's an official church religion, perhaps in Sweden as well. We obviously have many, many Muslim countries in the world where, they identify themselves as a primarily Muslim nation, which doesn't mean that others aren't protected under their constitutions. In all the vast world, there's one tiny, tiny little Jewish state. Which obviously came into existence in the aftermath of the Holocaust, when we got a pretty unmistakable object lesson that at a time when the Jewish people were threatened with actual annihilation, no nation no nation, many individuals, but no nation came to their defense as the Jewish people, not even our own. You know, we know that our own President Roosevelt declined to bomb the rail lines that were transporting Jews to the death camps. It could have been done. We did a lot of bombing of a lot of different places during that war, but we didn't do that. We know the story of the St. Louis, you know, the ship of Jewish refugees from Germany that was turned away at every port, and those people were ultimately sent back to Germany, and they were sent to their death. So this one small Jewish nation in the world is inevitably, because of the unique, singular nature of it, Jews everywhere in the world are at some level associated within their home countries with Israel. They may be critics of Israel, they may be strong supporters of Israel, but this is a very unique and particular dynamic. And that's why I say, look for the three-part test. Is demonization appropriate? No, it isn't. Harsh political criticism may be, but demonization crosses a line. Delegitimization is, I think, perhaps the most troubling aspect of the new anti-Semitism. As I said, you know, people may say, my gosh, the United States is awful, we hate what you did in Iraq, or, you know, waterboarding. We can, you know, pull up the list of criticisms of recent activities by the United States, but nobody says, you don't have the right to exist. You don't have the right to exist. You should be wiped off the face of the map. You are not a legitimate member of the community of nations of the world. That is said with great frequency about Israel. And then the third, which I think is also critically important, is double standards. Our standards being expected to be maintained by Israel apart and different from their neighbors and from other countries so situated and facing similar challenges. And so I do think that three-part test is a pretty helpful one. And if criticism doesn't invoke any of those attributes, any of those red flags go up, then I think it's just legitimate criticism and very much part of the necessary dialogue that we have. Thank you.